that now. I'm not sure if you get a icon or something on your window to tell you that we're recording, but I like to let everybody know before I start, because it puts everyone on guard to be a little bit polite, because eventually we'll be posting these recordings to Moodle. Normally, I prefer not to do the recording, mainly to encourage kind of personal participation. And once we get these audio problems sorted out, I do hope to be able to do a real tutorial workshop-y kind of component to our time together, because I think that could be very useful for what I'd like to get people thinking about. And that is, I want to go over largely the first assessment, and I've had a number of people ask me about it, and you've probably seen the traffic on the forums, wondering what all this is about. And I can understand that, because I remember when I was doing undergraduate philosophy, which is sort of probably now you know why you're getting all these crazy lectures. And before I studied ethics intensely, I was in one class, it was actually the philosophy of law, where one of the participants in the tutorial said, "What's all this about ethics? Isn't that an empty set?" And what this person, I think, was very honestly reflecting on was the way that in our part in history, we think that moral philosophy, the study of ethics and all that sort of stuff, is something you don't actually study, you kind of more like you feel. And there's really nothing to talk about with it. And so as a result of that, and also to a certain extent the way that in our culture at the moment, we tend to treat it as something that's more like a feeling than something you actually go to university and study. It does make a subject like this a bit of a odd thing. And a lot of them are run pretty much exclusively by, almost like a show and tell situation. And that's very much what we're trying to, we're trying to sort of do it in a balanced way with this unit. The idea is that we're going to be going through enough of the theory so that you're familiar with the kind of discussions and the ideas that have been battered around through history over the last few centuries, a few millennia really, but also with a practical edge to it. So now we move to the first assignment and what that's getting us to do. You'll know that for the last month or so we've been going through in a very, very condensed and rapid way pretty much 2.5 millennia of history regarding thinking about ethics. So that's an awful lot to take on board in a month. And what's even scarier is after that really short intensive to be asked to write an essay about it. And so I do appreciate that the essay is probably coming as a bit of a nasty surprise. So what I thought we'd do is go through the essay topic, kind of, and then unpack that in terms of what we've covered in classes, and look at how to approach it. If we get all that done, then I want to go through and do something similar to one of the early classes. There's a video just on the concept of truth and telling lies that you would have all seen, and what that attempts to do is demonstrate the way that telling the truth is not simply a cultural construct which happens to be popular in the Western world at the moment, but rather something that you can get by understanding the way the world is. And we'll get to that later on. And so what I'm going to do, if we get time, is apply that kind of thinking maybe to a couple of other questions. I'm thinking of murder for one, and maybe we might do another if we roll along. So that's the plan for today. Okay. First thing I want to do is look at the assignment. And to do that, I might start by sharing our screen, or sharing one of my screens. just while I find how to do that. Here we go, sharing screen, and I think you should be looking at okay. And all you're seeing there is something that you've probably looked at many times and pored over and worried about and all the rest of it. Okay, assignment 1, ethical theory. Okay, let's look at the 2 topics. First of all, there's a little bit of an introduction. We're talking about self-interest. We're looking for a particular situation. So we're saying that in the financial planning industry, self-interest can produce tensions. That's a very polite way of saying that we might be inclined to be a bit greedy, or people might be. But then the kicker is this part here. This is the question. Show how the various moral systems can be applied to resolve this ethical problem, and in doing so, how some moral systems are better than others. Okay. If we want to do that, the important thing about the essay is that it's asking us to look at the various moral systems and how they will give us a determination on whether self-interest is a good or a bad thing. So that's, if you like, probably going to be the body of the essay if you choose this topic. And the second part, show how some moral systems are better than others, is an invitation to compare moral systems, not simply say, you know, he said this and she said that and somebody else kind of came up with some other system, but to actually say, well, this one will probably be a better way to guide a community's action than that one. And so that's an important dimension of this. Let's look at the second topic. Here we're starting with kind of the equivalent of the second sentence in the first essay. We're basically giving an example of, you know, potential malpractice, unethical practice in the investment world. So we're simply making a statement, okay? So we're talking about insider trading. The essay isn't really about insider trading so much as being asked to show how various ethical systems, how many of them, can be employed to both permit and proscribe, in other words, prohibit insider trading. And so the challenge or the invitation there is to take the ethical systems one by one and see, can this ethical system permit insider trading, and can it also be used, the principle, if you like, that's core of this ethical system, can it be used to prohibit it? So a lot of people think that insider trading is not a good thing, and so you'd expect an ethical system to, you know, give it the thumbs down. But the tricky part here is that keep the devil's advocate kind of view open and to say, well, you know, if we look at a particular ethical system, could I use it to argue in favour of insider trading? And hopefully that will give you the opportunity to have a bit of fun with these different different principles. It's really sort of the acid test, if you like, to see whether an ethical system will actually give you the right answer, or the answer that you would think would be more sociable, you know, to a tricky question where a lot of people tend to be a bit inclined to want to cheat a little bit. And just talking about this one, it sort of often brings up really interesting conversations, especially when you're not being totally serious, maybe over a beer at a barbecue or something. Okay. Then it goes on. Outline a system of ethics that is the most immune to this duplicity. In other words, the ability of using the system to go both ways. What are its characteristics and how can it be applied? Okay, so it's really asking what Up here we're saying show how some moral systems are better than others. Here we're saying outline one which is better than the other. So pick your favourite and work with it. So that's an invitation for you. So if you're really keen on, I don't know, Hume's moral sentiment theory, then you can get the opportunity there to argue that using moral sentiment theory, you couldn't possibly justify insider trading as a kind of like an acid test. So that's what we're looking for. In terms of the depth and background and so on that's required, we've been giving you a small number of readings. I've tried to keep the readings down to a minimum. Could have given you a far longer reading list perhaps. One of the problems is that because we're covering all this material over a period of about a month or so, it's a bit unfair to get you to read, you know, a book by Kant and a handful of chapters by Hume and maybe The Prince by Machiavelli and all the rest of it. I mean, that's the sort of stuff that would be fine if we were doing a major in ethics, but we're really only just giving the highlights. So I'm not expecting huge amount of reading. However, evidence of familiarity with literature, especially literature outside of what we've set as you know, recommended, will be very positively you know, acknowledged. And the university, like all universities now, is very keen on reminding students that by all means use other sources and give quotes and that sort of stuff. Just make sure that you put quote sort of signs around the quotes you use, and always use citations to show where you get your ideas from, where you can identify them as coming from the books you've read or the articles or whatever they are. That shows that you're really, you know, doing stuff that academics are supposed to be doing. Okay, so I think that's the background. Now, do we have any questions or any comments? Just at the outset, I'd be interested if any of you would like to say, hey, that's all very good, but I don't understand what's really meant, or something like that.
Okay, so I've clearly been, can you hear me?
Great. So, yeah, you're not very loud, Christy. I'll just if I ask you to repeat yourself once or twice, it's not because I'm sort of being funny.
No, that's okay. Okay, so it says show. I was thinking of doing the first paragraph for the assignment. So self-interest, called attention, and it's got show how the various moral systems can be applied to resolve this ethical problem. So moral systems, obviously different from ethical systems, considering there's two different words. Now I've re-listened to the week videos and got extensive notes. So I've got a lot of information about Aristotle and the good of good. Is that am I on the right track with basically moral systems?
Okay, that's a good starting question. Okay, what's the relationship between the word moral and the word ethic? Now, I think that's important because we don't tend to use the M word very much in our culture at present. We tend to use the E word, so it's a nice thing to be ethical. Oddly enough, the word moral actually has negative connotations in a lot of circumstances in our culture. And so as a result, we tend to discourage using it a bit. For instance, if I was to accuse somebody of being moralizing, that would be a pejorative. It would be something that I'd say to them because I didn't like them. Whereas if I was to say to somebody, well, they're a very ethical person, then that would be a very good thing to say about them. Right? And so these two words of, you know, in our culture, in our part of history, that's just the way it is. To give you the definitions, in classical philosophy, if you like, if you look up a a philosophy dictionary, you would find a definition very much like: a moral is a principle for appropriate relations between intelligent beings. A moral is a principle for appropriate relations between intelligent beings. That sort of all sounds very formal and philosophical. But all it's saying is that a moral is a guide for action. Okay? That's hardly a bad thing. And it means that it's something that you might want to study, because the sort of stuff that we're doing now, we're really doing moral philosophy, because we're studying what are appropriate relations. Like, how do I, as a professional going out to a client, or as an educator going out to students, what is the appropriate way to go and sort of treat the other person in a relationship? So it's always about relationship. That's all a moral is. And so the negative connotations that in our culture now tend to be associated with the word moral, a little bit overdone. Moral, the word moral is probably the more correct term to use for everything we're doing in this course. When we look at the Fascia Code of Ethics, the Fascia Code of Ethics is one ethic which is particular to a specific occupational group, financial advisors, and it is made up of a number of standards. Each one of those standards is actually a principle for appropriate relations between intelligent beings. And so we could say that the Fascia standards is actually the list of principles, which is to say the Fascia standards are actually not standards at all. It's the list of Fascia morals. That's exactly what they are. We don't use that word because if, the Fascia Code or the FPEC Code, or in my case, the Australian Property Institute's Code, or whoever it is, Institution of Engineers, we tend not to use that term. What is an ethic? Again, go to the philosophy dictionaries, and while this definition is changing in recent times, the classical definition of an ethic is that an ethic is a set of morals. And so an ethic, singular, is a particular collection of principles for appropriate relations between people. And so when we talk about the Fascia ethic, yes, it's the Fascia Code, it's the Fascia set of moral principles, it's a set of morals. So we can talk about morals or ethics. The branch of study is traditionally referred to as moral philosophy. However, in the last 50 or 60 years, half century or so, we've started having people who do the sort of stuff that I do describe themselves as ethicists rather than moral philosophers. And it's largely because of the negative connotations with the word moral. So I want to take you through that, because it's kind of very important that you're kind of clear that we're actually doing both, if you like, and they're sort of so intimately connected that if you're talking ethics, you're talking morals. When we talk about whether we're talking morals or ethics and the particular people, it's because there have been a number of different ethical systems through history. Strictly speaking, the ethical system of, say, Immanuel Kant, which in different books you'll find described in different ways, so the duty, deontological ethical system, all that sort of stuff. Okay, and that's our attempt to look at how Kant determines what are the appropriate principles for appropriate relations between people. That's different to the ethical system proposed by David Hume and Adam Smith and others in the 1700s. And so we're talking about two very different ways of approaching the same problem. And that's what we want to compare with in the essay. So we want to say, well, Kant was actually trying, by the way, to justify the general approach of David Hume. Now, we haven't gone on to that. I don't think I've gone into that in class. Kant's coming, or I don't know, half a century later, or, you know, they kind of overlapped a bit. And he was saying, well, Hume's system actually is a bit of a dog. It doesn't work very well. So I'm going to retain its essential core, but I'm going to tidy it up a bit so it'll work better. Now, that was Kant's objective. And so he's got a different system. Okay, for our purposes in the essay, all we have to do is say, this is Kant, that's Hume. Kant gave us an ethical system or a moral system, whatever word you want to use for it. This is how it works. This is why it's good. This is why it might have a bit of a problem, that sort of thing. Does that sort of make sense? That's a long answer to a short question.
Yes, it's better. I'm busily writing notes.
Okay, yeah. And so what we can do, I was just trying to think of a parallel. It's not a lot of places where we have a number of major, a lot of major but competing theories trying to describe the same thing. Probably the best example I could think of off the top of my head is in the area of psychology. For my sins of, I took majors in both philosophy and psychology. Oh dear. Why? I don't know. I think only crazy people study psychology, but that's because I are one. When you look at psychology, it's really interesting. If you go along to a psychologist because you're not feeling very well, the psychologist might be a Freudian, might be a Jungian, might be a Maslow person, or any one of a number of probably 20, 30, I don't know how many psychological theories there are about how they go, how people go. So you go along and you feel a bit depressed. And someone might sit you down and get you to talk about your childhood and all that sort of stuff. Somebody else might give you a bit of a rattle along and sort of say, wake up yourself. Somebody might sit you down and basically try and work you through a discussion on why the reasons you're depressed are really stupid. It's called cognitive behavior therapy. They do it very, very gently. You know, there are all these different theories, right? They're all attempting to explain why you're unhappy, you're depressed or whatever. Right? In many cases in psychology, the different theories are completely incompatible. Certainly you can see that with the comparison, say, between Freud and Skinner, between the psychoanalysis, got a lot to do with, you know, childhood experiences and that sort of stuff. Skinner is like Pavlov's dog, you know, the idea that all we are is a set of stimuli and responses. Completely different approach to approaching the same question. Okay. You might go along to one psychologist feeling depressed and they mightn't do anything for you. You go along to another psychologist, they might sort of make you feel really, really good for 6 months. You might go along to another psychologist and you never feel depressed again. Right? And they might be doing completely different things. It's a similar thing with ethics or moral philosophy or all those things. You might decide to adopt one system of determining what's appropriate relations between persons, and that mightn't do anything for you at all. In fact, it might make your situation worse or your community situation worse. You might try another one and it might give you a better result, but then you might find somebody sort of works out a loophole into it, you know. And then you might find, or your community might find, by the way, these things happen over centuries, you know. You might find that your community or society actually sort of tweaks on one which actually causes a society to go from strength to strength and go from being just a bunch of, you know, kind of rough and ready tribal people to being sort of a great sort of global empire, you know, work for the English. So working out the systems is kind of important, and societies do tend to change their moral systems from time to time. I think it's one of the points I tried to make with the ancient Greeks. They went from a form of naive realism, about 1000 BC, 800, 600 BC. Then they changed over to the Sophists, and that sort of worked while everything was kind of wealthy and comfortable. And eventually the Romans came in and took them out. And you see that in other cultures as well. Our job is not just simply to do history for the fun of it, but it's to use a bit of history to understand a little bit better how to make good ethical decisions today. And that's the only reason we're doing history. I hope I haven't waffled on with that. Sorry. Anything else you'd like to add, or you've got any other questions? Have I clarified that or made it worse for you? I'm gonna, well, until you might have trouble with the microphone there, so I'll carry on. What I might do is, if anyone else has got any questions, just kind of come in and speak up. But what I'll do now, I'll just take us briefly through some of the major players that we've looked at. Well, there are a couple of ways of classifying or evaluating moral systems. One way is to give some thought to what the different moral systems are aiming at. And you can do that by asking the question, what is the greatest good that this particular moral system is shooting for? What's the greatest good? In classical terms, it's referred to as the summum bonum, the sum of all goodnesses. And so we can use that as a little bit of a test. What's the greatest good in this particular system? The other way that I find very useful in sort of understanding and classifying these, and this is something that I want to encourage you guys to think about when you're doing your essay, is to see if you can reduce the moral system down to a catch cry, a war cry, a one-liner. Okay? And if you can reduce the moral system down to a one-liner or maybe a two-sentencer or whatever you need, then that sort of helps to basically control it. We might say pigeonhole it without being derogatory. And so what I might do, I'll just take you through now the one-liners, and I'll ask you guys to give some thought to what the greatest good is for each one of these moral systems.
Sorry, Garrick, I'm just going to interrupt quickly if that's okay. John has a question, but he can't unmute to ask.
Okay.
Yeah, he asked if, at some stage throughout this today, do you have any references on greed among the current moral system?
References regarding, is it greed?
Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'll have to give that some thought. Off the top of my head, I can't. There's a paper that I was thinking of circulating around to you guys, and in fact, I will do it. It sort of slips in my mind from time to time. I did a paper a little while ago now. It was sort of partly tongue-in-cheek. It was for a conference presentation, and it was on resumption of land. The government compulsorily requires land occasionally, to, I don't know, build a bridge or a dam or something. And in the Australian Constitution, especially for the Commonwealth government, they are only able to take land back for just terms of compensation. That sort of bears a little bit on greed. Anyway, as part of this paper, what we do is ask the question of what justice means in terms of terms of compensation. And we basically go through, and I can't remember now how many, but a small handful, a couple of different moral systems, and the way that justice can be used to justify different resolutions to this compensation amount, you know, and it just sort of does it differently, right? So obviously, if I don't know, the Commonwealth government comes and decides to, I don't know, build a military base in my backyard and sort of takes half my property from me, I'm probably going to want more money than less, and I might even want more money than the property is justly worth. So I might be a bit greedy. But this whole question of justice in the Australian legal system, you find that word used in that section 51, I think, of the Constitution, but I could be wrong there. So I'll put that paper up for you. As far as looking at greed, you tend to find greed discussed more in its own right. Certainly, you know, this in the last 40 years or so, we've been tossing around the question of whether greed is good or not. In the 1980s, it was very popular for people to say greed is good. One reference that is a bit of a classic is to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which oddly enough, a lot of people don't think of Adam Smith as a moral philosopher, but in fact he was. In his book on moral sentiments is where you hear his metaphor of what these days we call the invisible hand. Most of you would have heard of the invisible hand. It comes not from his book on economics, actually comes from his book on morals. And what Adam Smith argued there was that self-interest, which is really a more polite word for greed, is in fact the like the mainspring that causes society, so the economic side of society, to actually function really nicely. And so this invisible hand notion, it's an economic notion, it's not a moral notion necessarily, but it sort of has moral overtones because realistically economic relationships are really a part of moral philosophy. Anyway, sort of Smith was saying basically that greed is the organising principle that causes us all to be happy and wealthy. And so that's a good thing. And what I was saying about the summum bonum, you know, the greatest good, for Smith, he would say, you know, the community all being happy and wealthy, or sort of like especially wealthy, that's my greatest good. And so what I write when I write in the area of political economy, economics, I'm writing it for the object of getting everybody to be as wealthy as possible. And Smith, as much as he was talking about the self-interest, he was really talking about the greed of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, actually having this extraordinarily good effect of causing the entire community to be wealthy. Yeah? So Adam Smith would be the best starting point for that. And there's an absolute mass of discussion over the validity of Adam Smith's invisible hand doctrine, if you want to call it that. And so if John wants to look into that, that would probably be a good place to start. And self-interest, greed is good, invisible hand, all of those should throw up a lot of material. Okay. One of the things about it, though, just you've only got 2,500 words, and I think a lot of people think that they have to probably do, you know, 1,000 words on each moral system, and we don't really want that. What I'd prefer to see would be, you know, a fairly brief, almost summary kind of treatment, so it doesn't have to go into extraordinary detail, and certainly not on every one. It's kind of nice to show sufficient familiarity to demonstrate that you know what these moral systems stood for, but you don't have to go to town on them. Simply, you know, you'd write a book on that, you know, and you know, that would be unfair. Okay. Now I think it looks like we've down to Christian Garrick, I think, just in terms of my little window here. But we'll carry on. Anything else, Christy, that you'd like to talk about before I go on to talk about the one-liners?
Yeah, there are others there. They're in the side box. If there's a little arrow, you can see John and Thompson. I'm not sure what her name is. I'm sorry, but she's there as well.
Okay, what I'll do, I'll just take the sharing off because that might give me a better view of what's going on. Great. So, okay, the sharing's gone. And if you want to break in from time to time, because while I'm talking, sometimes it's a little bit hard to sort of catch what's going on the chat box on the side. So if I miss something, just kind of break in and tell me. Okay. Terrific. Okay, what we'll do, we'll start to go through and look at the one-liners, I'm calling them. And this, if you like, just gives you, the highway ride through, let's say 2,500 years of history or so. And it'll give you, if you like, the material for a fair bit of your essay. Okay. We started off with the Sophists because in written history, or our written history, what we've got available to us, that's about the time when we start having sort of good, not just written records, but also robust discussion about these things. And what that means is that the Sophists back around the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries BC, they were really arguing with each other and trying to sort the stuff out, and we can still look at their arguments and so on. And that's good because even though it happened a long time ago, largely we're still talking about the same kind of issues. I haven't given you specific readings from the Sophists, but so I could do that, but I don't want to distract you guys into doing too much reading. It's more the concepts and the overall conclusions rather than the detail that I thought would be appropriate for here, because again, we're not doing a unit on the history of moral thought. We're doing something else. Let's look at what the Sophists did. The Sophists were what today we might call relativists. They believed that everything was relative to everything else and that man was the measure of all things. When you applied that to the moral area, especially when you define the human being, the human person, as merely a thinking animal, in other words, a truly material creature, when you think about what good means, if I'm nothing but matter, basically a bag of chemicals, then the Sophists reasoned like this. They said, well, for this bag of chemicals that we call a human being, the only thing which can be good is pleasure. And the only thing that can be bad is discomfort. What else is there? There's no point in, what's the good of having your name in a history book in 500 years' time if you're dead? So what? And so they would say that a healthy, rational person should aim to seek pleasure, and because they're social, it's a good idea not to hurt other people. And so the Sophist one-liner, if you like, it sort of leads from their view that good ultimately means pleasure. The Sophist one-liner is seek pleasure and harm no one. And that's it. So I think you'll find that in the lectures anyway. And you can find that from a number of sources in the writings of different Sophist authors back time. The proof that the Sophist ethic was very effective, in other words, a lot of people took it on board, was that the Greeks went through a stage of seeking wine, women, and whatever, we would call it sex and drugs, And they didn't do as much uncomfortable stuff as they used to, going out and fighting battles and all the rest of it. And in fact, if you apply the sophist one-liner to military service, what do you get? Anyone like to suggest how it'd feel? How would you act as a soldier if you pursued the ethic of seek pleasure and harm no one? Come on, guys.
It's going to be like taking over a country, but not hurting anyone.
Yeah. And what happens if the Romans come to town and they start sort of, wielding around their swords and all that sort of carry on? Right? You've got to seek pleasure, and you're not allowed to harm anyone. What do the blokes in Greece do when the Romans come to town?
Well, it looks like it's going to be a big party.
Yeah. So you see, it's an ethic which kind of looks good in the good times, and when everyone's basically playing ball together, it works pretty nicely. But it's absolutely no good for, national defence. So it's an ethic which, has its downside. I better not talk too long because otherwise we'll be here for hours. So you can have a lot of fun with the sophist ethic. If you want to give some thought, you'll find that the sophist ethic is alive and well today. I'm an old bloke. I was an undergraduate, so younger than you guys, in the 1970s when we had Woodstock and all that sort of carry on. And as an Australian, Mecca for me was Nimbin, where, young intelligent people would sort of go bush, buy cheap real estate in the most, God's own country, smoke dope and sort of live in communes and, basically have it off with everybody because we were following the ethic. I didn't go up there, by the way, tempting as it was. They followed the ethic of seek pleasure, harm no one. That was what the hippies were doing. It was sophistry. So it's a ethic which has never gone too far out of popularity. Okay. Oddly enough, I did go up to Nimbin later on, about 10 years later. At that stage, I was in property development, and I went up there as this sort of chap driving a little European sports car and all that sort of carry on. And one of the things I found kind of curious was that what I thought was Mecca when I was an undergraduate was an absolutely wonderful place for clinical psychologists, because the hippies that went up there in the 70s, 10 years later, they were suiciding and schizophrenics and suffering depression and so on, because sex and drugs actually causes you an awful lot of unhappiness sort of further on down the track. So anyway, I found that personally a great sobering influence. And my hippie clients, anyway, it's a story for another time. Okay, we better move along. Aristotle came along. Aristotle came along more or less at sort of the same time, in the peak of the Roman, the Greek culture. He gave us a one-liner, which is very similar. The one-liner for Aristotle is do good and avoid evil. So if you write that one down, do good and avoid evil. I don't know if I put that in the lectures. I think you can find that if you read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics all the way through. I couldn't tell you the exact location of it, but if you put that in your essay, do good and avoid evil, and attribute it to Aristotle, I won't be offended at all. It's got the same ring as the sophist one-liner. Okay? Do good, seek pleasure. What's the difference? Right? Likewise, avoid evil. Well, not harming anyone's evil. So the negative side of it, it's very similar. But if you scratch a little bit deeper, evil is a far bigger thing, or sorry, doing good is a far bigger thing than seeking pleasure. An example I like to give is pulling out splinters. You know, I'm a bloke. I sort of spent a lot of time in the bush in my earlier days. Splinters are an occupational hazard. And the thing I find really bizarre about when you get a splinter, and for any of you who have ever had a splinter, and I hope you haven't, normally we care for our own bodies. But if you get a splinter in your hand or something, all of a sudden you're motivated to attack your hand with sharp objects and stuff and do all sorts of harm, which normally you'd think you'd be crazy to do. And so there, doing good, getting out the splinter, actually is the opposite of causing pleasure. It actually causes hurt. But you know that by getting the splinter out, you're going to feel better in the future sometime. But you're actually technically, immediately not seeking pleasure. You're seeking to hurt yourself. Okay, and there are lots of places where, like Olympic athletes, you know, they wake up really early in the morning. They sort of run around and do crazy things that I'm glad I don't have to do. When they sit down to have breakfast, you know, they've got a few pills or who knows what they've got to eat. But they don't eat the sort of stuff that they feel like eating. And they very seldom seek pleasure, but they do seek the good. And we, you know, celebrate them with gold medals and stuff. Right? And those guys are definitely not seeking pleasure. You know, okay, you can argue. You're further on down the track, there's a pleasure of getting the gold medal. That's fantastic. And it is a pleasure. Right? But it's kind of a pleasure conformed to the good. And so giving some thought to that now, that's, if you like, the core of a whole sort of raft of ethical systems called virtue ethics. And many of you may have come across that expression. It's a lovely expression because it puts this idea of virtue onto the table. What's virtue? Virtue is a good habit, basically. That's about all it is. And you think, oh, gee, you haven't said much, Small. But we have said something very important. It's a habit, which means that you get it by repeating it. It's good, which is a nice thing. It's a lot better than being bad. But then pushes us to the question of how do we work out the difference between good and bad? And some people say, well, you know, this whole thing about virtue ethics, it's all a bit empty because, you know, talking about good really doesn't tell you anything. And that's because if we simply look at what we define as Aristotle's moral thought, we actually cut off an awful lot of his intellectual contribution. Aristotle is also dubbed as the father of, or the originator of, natural science or empirical science. And so an awful lot of what Aristotle didn't have anything to do about ethics and politics and all that sort of carry on. It actually had to do with the classification of things, you know, he had theories about biology, he had theories about physics. I think he probably had theories about chemistry. I just can't recall them at the moment. So he did an awful lot of science. And he gave us a method, a system of doing science. And so for Aristotle, he said, well, okay, when I've got my ethicist hat on, I'm going around saying do good and avoid evil. When I've got my scientist's hat on, Aristotle then says, well, I want to understand what good is, and I'll apply science to it. And largely that lecture or that presentation, the video on truth-telling is basically following the method, the moderate realist method that Aristotle proposed. So you've got to have Aristotle's, like, there's really two parts to Aristotle's ethics. One is his one-liner, which is virtue ethics, and the second part is the method of establishing what good means, and that's kind of very important. The way ultimately that all science is done, and moral philosophy is as much a science as physics or chemistry, is that it's done by finding out what things are and how they fit together, how they relate, how they cause each other to work. Science can be defined as the pursuit of certain knowledge through cause. And so whether I'm a chemist or a physicist or a mathematician or a moral philosopher, I'm looking for certain knowledge through cause. And so Aristotle kind of gave us that. And we'll do a little exercise with that a little bit later on. Okay, that takes us through Aristotle. We've talked about the Sophists. I'll just mention briefly the Stoics. Now, you would have heard this expression, Stoicism, or to be Stoic. The British culture is renowned for its Stoicism. The stiff upper lip of the British gentleman is Stoic. The Stoics aimed for serenity. They reasoned this way, that if I'm depressed because I've lost my sense of inner peace. And if I'm fearful, same thing. And they kind of developed this idea that serenity was the object of human life. A happy person was somebody who had serenity. Now, to a certain extent, it works, right? I would like to be serene. There are some times, you drive down the road and someone cuts in front of you. Are you serene? Be lovely if you were. You cut in front of somebody else unexpectedly. Are they serene? The next time you stopped in traffic, the person that you accidentally cut off sort of jumps out of their car carrying a great big crowbar and sort of comes and runs down and, sort of bangs on the roof or through the window or something, You can see there's no serenity there. So anyway, the Stoics believed that pursuing serenity was the object. They had a lot of different ways of approaching that, but basically pursuing serenity could be taken as either the greatest good for the Stoics or the one-liner, if you like, for the purposes of what we're doing. The problem with the Stoics' approach was that serenity is kind of not necessarily very active, and it sort of doesn't sort of tell you much. And at the time when the Stoics were writing what the Stoics were doing, the Stoics were actually trying to sort the Romans out. The Romans were at that stage spending more time with orgies and watching people sort of kill each other in the Colosseum and all that sort of carry on, and assassinating their relatives if they were in positions of importance. So the poor old Stoics were trying to get sort of some kind of balance back into the Romans and never really pulled it off. We don't have to worry too much about the Stoics. It's good to know what they're about. Serenity. If I was a serene financial advisor, it means I really couldn't give a hoot, Anyway, I'll let you explore that if you want to. We'll move along the next one of interest is Machiavelli. Machiavelli was writing very close to the year 1500. Certainly his life spanned, like it was either side of 1500. He is referred to as the father of modernity. Probably before we get to Machiavelli, we should just put a little bit of a plug for the medievals, especially Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas largely developed Aristotle. And so the method, virtue ethics, moderate realism, those terms apply as much to Aquinas as they do to Aristotle. But since we've talked about Aristotle, we've really talked about Aquinas as well. Sometimes it's better to read Aquinas because he's a bit more recent and a bit more systematic, and takes some topics a bit further. For instance, he has some really, really profound things to talk about with regard to financial relationships, just pricing when you're buying and selling stuff, and things like that. Has he added an extra one-liner to it? No. Most of the time he's really developing Aristotle, if we're looking at it from a strictly moral philosophy point of view. And really that sort of frames where Machiavelli comes in, because Machiavelli is coming in, Aquinas was the middle of the 1200s, so middle of the 13th century, middle of the 13th, 14th, 15th, so about 250 years later. The world had gone tired of the likes of Aquinas and they wanted a new ethic. And that's where Machiavelli comes in. Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and I think I have given a reading from The Prince. Definitely worth getting your nose into The Prince, especially from memory, chapter 15, I think, 14, 15, 16, around there. It's pretty easy reading. When I first read The Prince, I thought The Prince was a satire. I didn't think it was serious, a bit like More's Utopia. More's Utopia is pretty transparently a satire. It's worth reading, by the way. Whereas The Prince, it was actually meant to be a serious thing. It's basically a workshop manual for practicing monarchs. What's the one? What's Machiavelli's summum bonum, his greatest good? Machiavelli is recommending to his prince that the prince should appear to be virtuous while retaining the strength. And he uses a word similar like that, or an expression similar, very similar to that. Machiavelli would say the prince should have the strength to do wrong. Think of how that would feel if you went up to your bank manager to get a commercial loan for some venture you were sort of, keen on. And your manager was somebody who had read The Prince and decided to run his life by it. And so he appeared to be a virtuous man, but he retained the strength to do wrong. And let's imagine the bank was in the, 19th century America or something, where banks had the opportunities to be a little bit more cavalier. And so he might lend you money with the intention of ruining you. And the bank manager knew that he had to appear to be a fine and virtuous man, because if you got onto his real agenda, last thing you'd do was do business with him. Now, that's very much what Machiavelli was recommending for his prince. As I say, it looks like it should be a satire. He was deadly serious. And it's better if you read it for yourself rather than hear me talk about it, because it's just too bizarre to take seriously otherwise. But Machiavelli is worth getting to know. Okay, Machiavelli also, in terms of one-liners, set appearance as superior to reality. And that question of what's more important, appearance or reality, has been with us ever since. To a certain extent, the whole postmodern movement, which is a kind of a philosophical movement fundamentally, is about submitting to the idea that appearance is all there is. And so Machiavelli's endeavour to make appearance more important to reality, largely, the postmodern movement can be interpreted as a recognition that Machiavelli's revolution has worked. Okay, so pragmatism for Machiavelli, in other words, do what works. Machiavelli's greatest good was political stability. And so for Machiavelli, he was saying, look, Prince, you're the boss here. I want my country, or in fact it was the state of Florence, to be peaceful. I want political stability. I don't care how you do it. And in fact, if you're going to get political stability, the best way for you to do it is to look virtuous while having the strength to do wrong. Right? So that's kind of Machiavelli's kind of worldview. Is it a good ethic or not? I've probably given the game away as far as my views on it go. But there you go. By all means, kind of mention it in the essay. And some people think Machiavelli is great because it allows the strong to reap the benefits of their strength. Yeah, maybe. I don't think we would have had a royal commission into the banking industry if it wasn't for too many people in the industry probably modelling their business behaviours on Machiavelli. And yet, anyway, there you go. Machiavelli also, by the way, has one of the titles. One of his titles is he is the father of modernity. So we live in the modern era. We're passing into the postmodern era. Last 500 years or so, modernity. Who's the granddaddy of it? Machiavelli. So he's pretty important to sort of factor in. Okay, that does Machiavelli. Machiavelli was around 1500. You move forward to the middle of the modern period, which is probably the peak of the modern period. The peak of modernity, I would say, would be the 18th century, the 1700s. And it has dubbed itself the Age of Enlightenment. And so the 18th century is very fond of its achievements, which was largely to put more system into the philosophy that was begun by Machiavelli. Appearance is more important than reality. And so when we think about the Enlightenment thinkers, we think about, in the English tradition, primarily David Hume, also Adam Smith, although Smith tends to be associated more with economics. In Europe, we think about Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot, a handful of others, the encyclopedists and so on, a bunch of them. We can limit ourselves to the British Enlightenment thinkers. In British Enlightenment, you also include Thomas Hobbes, Newton, the chap who discovered gravity for us, and John Locke. Locke probably is the sort of, if you were to go, you would say Locke is probably the most important person beginning the Enlightenment thinking, and then Hume rounded it off. So they're both thinking in pretty much the same way. So Locke and Hume would be the two kingpins there in the English tradition. If you go onto the continent, Voltaire, Rousseau, and others. Okay, what did the Enlightenment period give us? Well, they were really a systematizing of what was begun with Machiavelli. Some people would kind of join Machiavelli with René Descartes. Descartes gave us the one-liner, I think, therefore I am. Now that's not a philosophical, no, it's not a moral statement. It's a general philosophical statement, probably more of a metaphysical statement. So we don't have to worry about Descartes. I just mentioned him because, just basically filling in all the faces that you need to know going through the model era. For our purposes, we can consider the Enlightenment as being the crown of modernity. David Hume. David Hume gave us moral sentiment theory. Hume gave us an entire system of philosophy, and so he's known as the father of British empiricism, his title. And so he sort of took this idea of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that I can only know what comes to me through my senses. So you don't even know that I exist. I might be just a computer program. You might be in the Matrix, the movie. Hume gave us that radical empiricist kind of view. I can't know anything that I don't touch, smell, see, hear, whatever. And from that, you end up with a moral system, because oddly enough, if you take the British empiricist view, what's a moral? A moral is a connection between two people through some sort of action. Okay? If I talk to you and tell you a lie, that's got a moral overhead and a moral value. If I walk up to you and punch you in the nose, the relationship between us, punching you in the nose, has got a moral kind of relationship. Hume would say, I can't know relationships directly. All I see is coincidences. You know, I move my fist in a particular way and your nose starts to have blood coming out of it. Isn't that strange? Isn't that a coincidence? I don't really know what caused your nose to get broken. You know, it just happened that it occupied the same space as my fist at one moment in time. But, you know, so what? Right? Bizarre. As an empiricist, Hume concluded that I couldn't see moral principles, I couldn't hear them, I couldn't touch them, I couldn't smell them. Therefore, they don't exist. Really simple. His solution was to say, well, we are involved in social kind of situations. I have to get along with the other people in my country. Sometimes people put people in prison. Da-da-da-da. Why do they do that? And he talked about, you know, customary coincidences, that sort of stuff. But what he then said was that morals or moral values are simply the result of some inner sense, like a third eye or something. And so this idea that I can't talk about morals, I simply see them. And I don't see them through my eyes, I see them through this inner sense. Like, you know, some people reckon they can see aura around people. I don't know about that. But, you know, you see someone punch somebody else in the nose and you feel bad about it, and that feeling is the moral. So that's your moral sentiment theory. So the one-liner for Hume is that moral values come from an inner moral sense. And Hume would say, well, you know, it's easy to see that's the way that it goes, because first of all, Hume would claim that he had proven that you can't know morals because you can't get them through the senses. But he recognises that people share some sort of, you know, acceptance that morals exist. So he says, what's a moral? Okay. It is something, you know, this common evaluation that people put on actions. And he says, you know that morals exist because everyone thinks the same way. And so everyone in the society thinks that cold-blooded killing of innocent people is a bad thing. Therefore it's bad. And it's not bad because it's bad, it's simply bad because everyone feels the same way when they see murder. That makes moral discussion really, really easy. I sort of come up to you and say, do you feel good if I murder you? And you say, oh, I don't feel good if you murder me. I don't feel good when I see other people getting murdered. Therefore, let's share this value that murder is bad. And that works because, to a certain extent, we can respond to our feelings. Some people call it conscience. And by and large, healthy people do have a bit of a revulsion when it comes to watching people being, I don't know, tortured and killed and stuff. Right? What's the downside with the moral sentiment theory? Anyone like to suggest? I've been talking for a long time. It's about time somebody else sort of said something. Anyone on there? What's the problem with moral sentiment theory? How can I show that it's maybe not always as robust as we'd like it to be? Come on, guys. Maybe everyone's just gone off for a coffee.
Sorry, I did stop off to get something to eat, so I missed some of that.
Yeah, right. No worries. Okay. Just have a punt. Well, what's the downside? How, if you were to set out to try and talk someone out of Hume's moral sentiment theory, what would you say to them? Why isn't reliable to just have morals as feelings?
I think that we get taught a a lot of our morals from people. I think we get taught a lot of our morals, generally from people who are raised by people around us.
Yep. No, that's true. We get taught them. But how about if we just stay with the proposition, the claim that human beings all have a moral sense and they all sense the same things when presented with particular situations. Is that convincing?
No.
Why not? Yeah, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, right? Give me a place where you could say that's evidence that this moral sentiment stuff doesn't work.
$100 note on the ground.
Say again?
$100 note on the ground.
Good on you. Okay, yep.
Some will attempt to find an owner and probably go to the nearest shop and pick it up and say, this is what I found. Someone might come back for it or take it to the police station. Some people pocket it.
Fantastic. Yeah. Different people feel differently about moral obligations in particular situations. Right? I mean, any self-respecting rapist and mugger wouldn't be going around saying, I feel so bad about raping you and murdering you, right? They're feeling like this is the best thing to do on a Saturday night. And, people who, are guilty of corporate crime, they feel like it's a great way to feed their families. There are lots of places, and you don't have to be totally a psycho, to simply feel like doing things which are objectively very disordered. Usually just about everything which is, we might say, immoral or unethical actually feels good. It in fact has tremendous benefits. As a consultant in some way, I might have a way of getting fabulously wealthy, maybe by, you've heard of the bank scam, where these computer programmers take the decimals of a cent from, 10,000 people's, interest payment every month or whatever. The people don't find it, because it's like my interest was supposed to be 12.6 or 12.4 cents, and the bank's only given me 12 cents. I don't mind. Put it through my calculator, I'm happy. The bank doesn't really mind because they're expecting to pay the 12.4 cents, and you get some little enterprising computer programmer who's just basically skimmed off all these decimals of interest payments, put them onto some account, and end up making themselves millionaires. There was a number of, these sort of a bit of an old game now. This was happening back when computers were the novelty, in the 70s and 80s. No one is harmed, supposedly. The computer programmer felt really good about it. Nobody felt bad about it, but it was theft. Anyway, that's a kind of really domestic example. And your example about the $100 on the ground, you're 100% right. Yeah. This moral sentiment theory, it doesn't really go anywhere because people have differences. And really, if moral sentiment theory worked, you wouldn't have any bank robbers or muggers or anything like that, because everyone would feel the same way. Okay, so that sort of takes us through moral sentiment theory. I said earlier that Kant tried to sanitize moral sentiment theory, and that's pretty much what he did. Kant, his greatest good was, the word is duty, but the way he got to duty was this sense of self-respect or honour. And he had a bunch of different arguments as to why people were happiest when they accepted duty. And so Kant, his greatest good, most people would say duty. It's not quite right, because Kant would himself argue that duty was only there for something else. But, duty's fine because duty kind of, you're looking at Kant. If you're talking about morals and you start talking about duty, most people say, oh, you're a Kantian. Right? So the greatest good, summum bonum for Kant was duty. Well, we'll say it was. But duty for the sense of honour kind of business, if we really want to be, complete with it. And how do you get to do your duty? Kant would say that it's not moral sentiment. What you would do if you're faced with some moral dilemma, the $100 on the ground, you would ask yourself, or you would follow the course of action that was the result of applying a maxim, a principle, which could reasonably be a universal law. So it's phrased a bit complicated. Kant was a philosopher, and so I guess philosophers tend to sort of make simple things complicated. But simply spoken, or simply put, Kant would say that we have a duty to act on what we consider to be principles that could work as moral laws. Okay? It's called the categorical imperative. That's the buzzword which is associated with Kant. You're most welcome to read, excuse me, Kant's, excuse me, Metaphysics of Morals. I think that's the title of the book. Metaphysics of Morals. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the title. And in that, he basically sets a series of arguments as to why you should, make your rule of action based on principles that could become a universal law, could be accepted as a universal law. Now, Kant is really tricky. When I first read Kant, I thought, whoa, that's the answer. That makes so much sense. And the professor at the time was very much enamoured of Kant as well. So we were both jumping around saying, hey, this is really marvellous. We've got to the end. We've answered the moral question. Right? Because this idea of universality is something which is really important. At the end of the day, if you deal with me and I've got my moral system, and then you deal with Jose and he's got his moral system, or John and he's got his moral system, right? And I've got to deal with all of you guys and Christy, and you've all got your own moral systems. Well, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to get to the conclusion that you can't have everyone with their own moral system. The only thing which really works is when everyone's pulling together following the same moral system. We talk about people having different values and different views and that sort of stuff. And sure enough, I mean, I have a different view to, I don't know, my affinity for eating curry to maybe, most of the people on this in this workshop. Yeah, I've got different views on there. That's fine, no problem. But when it comes to if I had different views to eating human flesh, and whose human flesh I was going to eat, you probably wouldn't want to hang out with me socially. We wouldn't have much of a society. Anyway, where am I going with that? Kant's categorical imperative is sort of interesting because he's saying moral sentiments don't work. You have to live your life, solve the ethical question, if you like, by getting to these principles that could become universal laws. And that sounds pretty good because we're at the stage where we recognise that universality is really important. Anyway, I won't go too far down that track. What's the downside with Kant? Now, he did a pretty good job with Hume. Jerry, you could sort of think of a way or a situation where Kant may not work, or applying Kant could be a bit problematic. What do you reckon? Tick, 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 tick. I'll give you the answer. Ultimately, Kant is allowing the moral actor to decide what's a reasonable universal law. And so everyone gets to play God, because everyone gets to be the final judge on what could be universally applied. For instance, I could say it'd be quite reasonable as a universal law to let blue-eyed men rule the world. You may not notice it, but I'm blue-eyed. I don't mind that as a universal law. Maybe there are a couple of people around the place that may not like it, but who cares? I think you just do a very nice universal law based on that. It's pretty much what Hitler did. With the $100 on the footpath. If I felt inclined to pick it up and put it in my pocket, I said, well, I reckon there's a universal principle. People should be allowed to pick up stuff where they find it. And as long as no one comes along and, harasses them otherwise, let them take it and put it in their pocket. That might be reasonable. I don't know. Somebody else might use Kant to say, well, if I see a $100 note it could come from a little old lady who might be her, pension check, and she might be starving for the next 2 weeks or something if she doesn't get that $100. And so they'd take it along and take it to the police station and try and find the owner. And they'd say it should be a universal principle that people should not pick up stuff lying on the ground and put it in their pocket and treat it like their own. If it wasn't a $100 note, but maybe something that was maybe worth about $100. Let's say, the key to a nice new BMW SUV. I don't think they've got sort of ignition keys anymore. But whatever it is that sort of magically makes them go, might cost about $100. I sort of see one lying on the ground. Would that universal law sort of be as applicable? Especially when it gives me the right to drive around with whatever I find that it sort of gets started. Okay. So I think the thing about Kant is that it suffers from the same problem ultimately that Hume does, that Kant allows the moral actor to make up his own moral universals. Unlike Hume, who said, well, that's just a matter of your feelings, for Kant, you're actually saying that I've decided that such and such could be a universal law. Financial advisors should be allowed to tell their clients anything, even if it sends them broke. It could be a universal law because maybe, everyone should, be smart enough not to trust financial advisors, which is pretty much what happens when you live that kind of thing. Anyway, Kant is a little bit trickier to get your head around than Hume, but it basically, runs into the same kind of problem ultimately, that it can easily be used. You a couple of beers and sitting around a barbecue, you can use Kantian categorical imperative to, justify just about anything. But you can sort of do it with a bit more finesse than with David Hume, I guess. Okay, that takes us into the 20th century ones. I think you'll see if you go through the lectures on the 20th century moral systems, the idea that a moral or an ethic is no more than a way of influencing other people to do your will. Pretty easy to see through that. And the others are also pretty thin. But if you get through those main ones, the main ones to deal with would be the Sophists, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hume. Oh, we've forgotten Bentham and Mill, the utilitarians, and that's really important. Bentham and Mill, mega important because Bentham and Mill, utilitarianism. Word just slipped my mind for the moment. The idea that you can do some sort of like a scientific calculation of the benefits and costs, which is what we do in economics, of some course of action. And as long as the benefits outweigh the costs, then the course of action is reasonable. That's what utilitarianism ultimately comes down to. Not only we being utilitarians personally and privately, but we're also being utilitarians for public policy. And when you recognise that utilitarianism is the moral system that is often invoked by politicians, not just for economic things, but also for other questions, marriage issues, property issues, who knows what. Utilitarianism is often invoked because this will make most people's lives better off. The greatest good for the greatest number is the one-liner for Bentham and Mill. Bentham, who came a little bit before Mill, was very much like the Sophists. He thought that the only thing that was good was pleasure. Mill tried to expand the idea of pleasure being the greatest good into kind of including what we call sort of like intellectual pleasures. He was a bit vague about it, but he could sort of recognise that sometimes just the delight of solving a crossword, we call it a pleasure, but it's not exactly like, I don't know, a glass of fine wine or something. It's sort of like an intellectual kind of bit of satisfaction. So for Bentham and Mill, the greatest good was the greatest pleasure, admittedly a little bit more broadly defined than simply sensual pleasure directly. But he socialised it by, unlike the Sophists, saying personally you seek the greatest pleasure and don't harm anyone. The utilitarian would say, just make sure that the total pleasure is greater than the greatest cost. Okay. Downside with utilitarianism? Any suggestions? I think we might be getting down on our numbers here. Okay. Problem with utilitarianism is that it's a bit indifferent to who's getting the pleasures and who's getting the pains. If you're aiming to simply get a greater sum, what that means is that if I do something which causes you a little bit of displeasure but me a big bit of pleasure, like I might really enjoy beating you up on a Saturday night or something, if I get more enjoyment from beating you up than you suffer from being beat up, then from a utilitarian point of view, it's actually valid. And this idea of who the winners and losers are, and also the calculus. You know, if I have to work out the pleasures and pains, I might be a little bit biased. So the people who, you know, I might think my pleasures are more important than your pains, or my tribe's pleasures are more important than your tribe's pains. Yeah, there are lots of problems with utilitarianism. Any guys want to mention anything that could be examples of where they could be falling off the rails? No? Okay, well that basically finishes it. If you do a summary of those ideas, and especially spend a bit of time just thinking about where, in the case of insider training or maybe self-interest, you could use Hume's moral sentiments or Kant's categorical imperatives to either justify doing the right thing, which we think of as the right thing, or the wrong thing. Then that's pretty much the essay done. Okay, last thing I wanted to any questions about what we've covered so far? Nope. Okay. Last thing I wanted to do was run through another example hopefully in a workshop mode, but got the feeling I'm going to be the only one talking for the rest of the morning. Just reading through the chats. Okay. Where are we? Yeah, well, what I was thinking of doing was just run through another example of where we can identify a moral principle by considering the things that are involved. Okay. And what I'll do is we'll just talk about murder. To begin with, murder is not simply killing people. Soldiers kill people, and that's not murder. Self-defense involves one person killing another person sometimes, but it's not murder. Likewise, manslaughter, as much as it's often sort of the result of a bit of imprudence, it's not murder. So we have to distinguish between what murder is and what it's not, because certainly you don't want to accuse soldiers, maybe acting in defence of their own country or what have you, as murderers. Sometimes we do these days, but usually it's in places where the soldiers really probably shouldn't be there in the first place. So okay, that's a completely different topic. I'll give you the definition of murder. Murder is the cold-blooded killing of an innocent person. So it has to be cold-blooded, so not done through emotion, which would be self-defense or manslaughter perhaps. It has to be cold-blooded. And it's the killing of an innocent person. And so that then takes out the situation of soldiers fighting in a just war, or maybe an executioner, pressing the button on a notorious criminal, maybe a murderer, who just authority had sort of decided should pay with their life. Okay, so we've got murder. Murder, cold-blooded killing of an innocent person. Is that simply a decision of a community of people decided democratically, and a different community of people could democratically decide otherwise? Or is it something which is in all places and all times and all situations, if you like, illegal and, immoral? Okay. First thing I'd like to ask you about is now it's relative. Okay, Thompson to everyone? Okay. Let me put some propositions to you. If we're talking about me perhaps taking life of somebody else, what's the relationship, just notionally, between me and another human being? Is it a relationship of inequality or not? We have a lot of political action in our world based on the premise that human beings are equal. Amnesty International, I think, is a good example. And that organisation is based on a whole lot of people who share one idea in common, and that is that because people are human, they have equal dignity. It is a dreadful thing when one government is treating people, whether they're their own people or others, in a way which is inhuman in some way, incarcerating them, torturing them, murdering them, whatever they're going to do. If we assume that human beings are equal, okay, that's a proposition if you like, and it's probably a debatable proposition. We can then start to put together, if you like, some obligations that's come merely from the equality of humans. What this means is that when we're getting to talk about moral issues or ethical issues, then assuming we start from an accepted view that human beings are equal, and if human beings have individually a right to themselves. So as a human being, do I have more or less right to being here than other people do? Especially, do I have a right to your life? Now, you can say, well, yeah, everyone owns their own life. And if people own their own life, then they don't own other people's lives. And if they don't own other people's lives, then they don't have a right to take what doesn't belong to them. And so to take something which belongs to somebody else, naturally, will always be a form of theft. So it will always be a form of taking something, causing an inequality. In classical thinking, there was a lot of emphasis on notions of like mathematical relationships, proportion, equality, and so on. And so in this question of murder, the equality that we begin with a relationship between persons is an equality which is disturbed if I was to take something from another person that they own and I don't, especially since it's something like life, where I have a right to my life, and if I have a right to my life, then other people have a right to their life. And what that does is it basically sort of takes out any opportunity or any moral justification for me, on one hand, claiming my right to my life. It takes out any opportunity for me to start with that premise and then move to a conclusion which justifies me not applying the same respect to other people. So with murder, given the initial premise of the equality of humans, if the equality of humans is a valid concept, a valid statement, valid thing, then murder becomes naturally, like it becomes a unethical thing merely because of the nature of what's involved. Now, what we're really saying there is that it all depends on accepting that one key premise. Now, my belief that I have a right to my life might be simply a cultural view. My culture might believe that humans have rights to their own life. The ancient Greeks believed that people didn't have rights to their own life, and so slavery was something they were very comfortable with. And we see that in lots of other places. The Thuggis in India at the time of the British Raj, it's a complicated event, but from what I understand of it, they believe that their religious observance included strangling other people. So culturally, that wasn't respected, and you've got instances of cannibalism, say in the Pacific Islands or in or in Africa and so on, would sort of justify that sort of culturally. The question is not whether or not cultures do these things, it's a matter of coming back to this question of the inequality between humans. We can take different views on that. I guess we can rephrase the question almost in the reverse and put it in terms of what is the argument in favour of the inequality between people? And that becomes a bit more difficult. Now, I think we've got...
a question, Gary.
Yes, Jose?
I think Claire has just typed out a question. Are you able to see that on the chat?
Let me look at my chats. So I've been not watching those while we've been doing this stuff, just so that I don't get too distracted. The programming of autonomous vehicles takes the value of life into account, and the outcome differs in different cultures. That's interesting. How I would choose to program the vehicle to protect a particular life differs from others. Act to protect, causing harm versus inaction, causing harm. Okay, so this is a situation where the autonomous vehicle perhaps would choose to avoid causing harm to the occupants. What's that?
Is she referring to if it was to, the vehicle was hitting a child, would it swerve away from the child and hit an animal instead?
Yeah, or maybe hit a lamppost and kill the occupants.
Yeah.
Is acting to deliberately take an innocent life murder or justified? Oh, these are wonderful questions. Some countries value animals over humans. Does this make a difference? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We were looking at the proposition, the premise of human equality as we started to look at this, and I think your point here is a good one. I'm not sure if I've got Thompson C as the name, so I'm not sure whether that is who's the family name in there, but if you don't mind me referring to you as Thompson, then we'll just talk about this. Yeah, what we have is we do have situations where there will be bad consequences to particular actions. I think this is a good one, and there's probably a number of them. Situations where in order to avoid some definite bad thing happening, some other bad thing may happen. In moral thought, there is a principle called the principle of double effect. And this is really, I think, an example of this. Principle of double effect works like this. I'm just trying to think of an example. This is a pretty good example of it. Principle of double effect would be that you're programming the car, the vehicle, and there is a situation where the vehicle is thinking that it's definitely going to run over a child, and so it simply swerves in order to get away from that event as reliably as possible, which may cause it to do some other bad thing, like run into another vehicle or run into a tree. No? The principle of double effect would say that if by willing a definite good, you introduce the risk of some other bad thing, we'll call it an evil, like a material evil, which could be running into the tree, sort of hitting a dog, whatever, then you must aim to do the least harm. you could sort of look at it and say, do the most good. But yeah, it's a technical one. Often it's where you choose to do some good knowing some evil will result. For instance, an example, and it doesn't have to do with motor cars, is a situation which apparently is not that uncommon, called an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is where a lady falls pregnant, but the fertilization takes place in the fallopian tubes, which is not where a baby can grow very far. And if an ectopic pregnancy is left alone, that growing baby will end up causing all sorts of major gynecological failures and eventually the death of the mother. And so there's no way that that baby, healthy little soul that it is going to be able to get born. And if it's left in place, it's definitely going to kill the mother. Now, difficult situation, because it means that you're choosing to kill an innocent person, which is murder in cold blood. The resolution there is that the decision is to save the mother's life from definite death. And in saving the mother's life from death and death, and it's going to be the baby's death and death as well, then you basically leave the baby, the fertilized zygote, to its own devices, which is most likely going to cause it to die, and it just about always does. And so there, the important thing is that the willing is willing to avoid a definite evil, or conversely put, it's willing to save the mother's life, which is a definite good. The consequential effect, which is an evil thing, is the secondary effect. So this rule of double effect is that sometimes it's the second effect, it's the double effect, it's the secondary kind of thing, which is an evil thing. It's a little bit different to consciously willing, sort of going in and saying, oh, now I've got an excuse to go and sort of murder this baby. Dealing with an ectopic pregnancy, basically by sitting back and saying, oh, gee, I've got some moral obligation not to perform an abortion, really what you're doing is murdering the woman by leaving her in a situation where she's definitely going to die. Now, I think in this situation, if you've got something, and this is one of the problems I think with programming autonomous vehicles, is that you've got to take into account these decisions when you're doing the programming, which is a long way different and separated from the actual event. You could probably apply this quite simply and say, well, I'm driving my car and, suddenly a kid runs across the road sort of chasing a ball. Now, that's a decision that the autonomous vehicle has got. It's just that it happens, quickly. But it's the same decision, okay? Do I swerve? Okay? If swerving causes me to see, well, actually, there's a bus right next to me, and if I swerve and I'm driving my, Mercedes truck or something, and that bus is going to go off a cliff, and there's, 20 people on board, the kid with the ball is safe, and I've just killed 20 people. I think the law of double effect would say, whatever you do, don't sort of run into the bus and try to, navigate so that you don't sort of cause the termination of the silly kid. Maybe you can just hope that he'll sort of flatten himself on the ground and he'll sort of drive over with your truck, and as long as he doesn't put his head up, he might survive. You're not actually willing his death. You're certainly not gunning for him so that the driver's side wheel is sort of crushing his head or something. You get the idea? Some countries. Okay. last part. Some countries value animals over humans. Does this make it? Oh, of course it does. There we're getting to a very delicate question, because if the people in that country value an animal seriously and conscientiously as a part of religious observance, as something that they see as an obligation before God, then the animal has got, by divine positive law, to speak technically, a status above the human. It does bring up the rather delicate question of whether a religion that does that is, their understanding of God. I mean, we're talking about something that you can't see, touch or feel. You can get to the questions for the, proofs for the existence of God in different ways from touching and feeling it. But I mean, it's pretty important that you're dealing with the right religion. I mean, if I have a religion that believes that cockroaches are sacred, and you believe in a religion that believes that humans are sacred, well, we've got different gods, we've got different views. It certainly is a cultural difference, but you probably want to ask the question: is it reasonable to believe in that religion? And there you want sort of other proof, I guess what I'm saying. But as far as the culpability of the people in concern, if you've got somebody who seriously believes their religion and believes that, there are people that there's a religion, for instance, that believes that vegetables have equal dignity, equal status to humans. And so for followers of that religion, eating a carrot is murder. I don't follow that religion. I respect people's religious zeal in choosing to follow that religion. I think the interesting question, probably not when you're sort of sitting over a salad deciding what to eat and what not to eat, is probably whether that God is worth believing in. And I think that's a different question to the ethical question. It's a theological question and sort of a bit outside what we're doing. Okay. Oh, and Claire, thanks for introducing yourself. I appreciate that. There is a survey on how you would program the vehicle. At the end, it shows the different countries' response. Yeah, no, good one. It is very interesting and also brings up problems if the vehicle is programmed in one country or culture. Whoa! Isn't that excellent? Yeah. Mate, I wish your microphone was working. This would be a really, really interesting conversation to take forward. Yeah. Yeah, no, and what you say about being a Kantian until you did the survey. How do I say this? There are two basic views. One view is that ethics are things which are different for different people, and there is really no objective right or wrong. That's one view. It's a very popular view, especially popular view in our culture. And the other view is that there is really can only be one genuine ethic. Not to say that the people who follow other ethics are necessarily bad people. The people that don't eat carrots, for instance. I hope they wouldn't think I was a bad person because I ate carrots. And in the same way, often people who might respect things that I don't respect, I think that it's inappropriate to be critical of them as people because they might be doing it out of absolute zeal and good nature, but they might even think that it's got their religious obligation to go and sort of knock me off. Certainly that was the case with the Aztecs and many like the South Americans and the Fijians and the New Guineans and all the other cannibals that have been around the world, but especially the Aztecs. They found that it was or believed that it was religious observance to torture people. Makes you kind of, I could imagine that a lot of people would become Aztecs or follow their religion, because if you're on the other side, you are likely to be, tortured to death or whatever. But can there be ultimately two different genuine ethics? Okay, so what I'm trying to do is distinguish between the people who follow an ethic and the ethic itself. So it's one thing to say, yes, you're a cannibal. I can see you doing that with the best of intentions, but I don't think cannibalism is a good idea. Right? So there are like two different issues. And I'm glad that you recovered from Kantianism when you did the survey, because it does really sort of show up the way that it is difficult to be a complete moral relativist. Usually moral relativism is associated with shakers and movers that want to be able to do evil with impunity. And that's largely what you find behind Machiavelli. I mean, the whole circumstance of Machiavelli is a really interesting bit of historical read. Florence at the time was a bit of a muddled place. The prince that he was writing it for was a really muddled person. I don't think was necessarily a very good person. It's just you find historically a lot of bad morals have come in because of self-serving ends. Okay. Anyway, I'm rabbiting on here. And thanks, Jose, for mentioning that. Okay. This is interesting to have to talk about. Running a workshop, where I'm not sort of hearing other people is a little bit of a strain. I set out today to go over the essay primarily, to give you a summary of how to approach the essay appropriate for the course, because as I say, this is not an entire unit subject on the history of moral systems or that sort of stuff. This is only sort of like a 1 month introduction to it, and so I'm definitely not expecting a great deal of depth. I've gone over, if you like, a little bit of a summary of the good sides and the bad sides of the major moral systems. I haven't covered all of them, but certainly the major ones which have dotted the last 2.5 millennia. And I think the ones which are probably important for you to have your head around. I mean, you could deal with Karl Marx, for instance, as a moral philosopher in both his Communist Manifesto and his other writings and so on. I mean, we haven't bothered to do that. Maybe there might be some hardcore Marxists who are offended because I've left him out. And there are other people, especially in the 20th century. So we haven't done that. But generally, the big issues that we're aiming to look at is objective versus subjective ethics, an introduction to the different one-liners that have been popular and the way that we're tended to use those today, and the way that we can unpack them and see that some moral systems are better than others. Okay, the exploration through looking at murder, and I really do appreciate, Claire, you bringing up these examples, especially the moral vehicle, the autonomous vehicle sort of one. That's something that we're going to be seeing a lot more in the near future. And you've actually given me the willies now, because I'm thinking I was looking forward to driving one of those, or rather sitting as a passenger. I do a fair bit of driving across New South Wales, and I love cruise control, and if they could do the steering and the braking as well, I'd be a happy boy. But I'm just thinking, crikey, If that means I sort of sit back and watch kind of, toddlers get sort of run over. Scary stuff. Anyway, I'll rabbit on for too long. I really should sort of finish and let you guys get off to do whatever else you're going to do. We've had now 2 hours, which is a pretty long encounter. So I thank you very, very much for that. I thank you, Claire, for your kind words and also your interesting observations. I really appreciate that. So I think what we'll do, we'll finish off now. I'll put the recording up. I think I'll just put it up as a sound recording because the graphics aren't that pretty, unless anyone's got any other different views. But thank you very much, and we'll finish it there.